On July 15th, the Federal Court of Appeal heard a case like no other. It's the last stand for 400 healthy ostriches located on a rural farm in Edgewood, British Columbia, against the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's plans to cull them, even though they've been healthy and asymptomatic for months. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, and today I bring you an interview with the farm's counsel, Umar Sheikh, about what he argued in court.
They are not replaceable. These are decades and decades of genetics. These are decades of personalities and animals that have been touched by the hands of our family. And they've been raised by my mom's hands, by us as kids' hands. They're named. They have personalities. They're loved beyond belief. There's no replacing that. And these animals, I think we need to get out of that mindset that we can just replace them. Once we take away the genetic diversity and we take away that natural immunity that is sitting on a farm, then you replace it with a young, naive immune system animal. They're still exposed to what is out there. So we're just seeing a repetitious pattern where these animals are still getting reinfected. But now what we're doing is we're losing the strength and the natural immunity, which the survivors, which you do not kill, those survivors should be protected and tested and pulled out. And then those survivors are going to pass down their antibodies to their young, where their young will pass it down. And then we keep immunity.
What you just saw there was a clip of Katie Pasitny, the adult daughter of Karen Esperson, who owns the Universal Ostrich Farms alongside with her partner, Dave Belinsky. And for months, as many of you know, they have been fighting to save their flock and fighting against government overreach that says that their flock should die, even though they were two carcasses, I should say, tested positive back in December for the avian flu, and they argue that their birds that are alive, nearly 400 of them, have been healthy and asymptomatic for 180 days. As I bring you this report of what happened in the Court of Federal Appeals in Ottawa, the farmers are still making their way back. They had a couple of delays on the way back home, so I have an interview coming up with them soon. But today we are joined by Umar Sheikh, who is representing them thanks to crowdfunding efforts at a site which I will link in the description box below in the article for this report. Sheikh argued on 5 different grounds for the appeal to the decision that was handed down by a Justice Zinn back in spring in the lower court. That decision upheld the CFIA's cull order after the farm had brought forth a judicial review. Now, before we dive into the hearing itself, I know many cannot seem to wrap their head around how it's even possible for the CFIA to cull healthy animals this much later after they tested positive. Could you explain what their position on that is?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that I understand it, it's the stamping out policy is designed to stop disease spread quickly, specifically with relation to H5N1 and this infection that can spread very, very quickly across animals and potentially into humans. And when they developed this policy, it was based upon chickens and turkeys, essentially. And so, when it comes to chickens and you look at the data, they're in these coops together, they're densely populated. Individual testing doesn't make very much sense, and stamping out the virus seems to be an alternative which they've considered and they thought makes sense. With ostriches, it's a bit different, right? With their own experts, they've testified that the ostriches mostly recover within 2 weeks. They're not chickens, they're not turkeys. And so, when it comes to mad cow disease or when it comes to other diseases which have, this very high mortality rate, very high infection rate, it can make sense to have such a policy, but you can't make it a one size fits all. There has to be enough consideration to be able to say, wait a minute, if these animals are recovering and they're not posing a risk and we're in quarantine zone, right? So initially it was speculation in December, trade impacts will occur. infection will spread, environmental contaminants will happen. All of this was speculation. Well, we're now 7 months out. Quarantine has worked, right? That speculation is not borne out. We don't have rampant infection. We do have recovery. We don't have any evidence of environmental contamination. We don't have any evidence of trade impacts. And so that context matters, and we're in a very different time. So even if in December you thought, okay, well, this really needs to be done right away, first you're applying something that shouldn't apply to ostriches. But fair enough, even if you thought that, you certainly can't maintain that position today on that speculation when the reality and the facts are that quarantine has worked. And so that's what makes this really difficult, right? It's one of those, we're going to do it because we said we're going to do it. And, let me be clear. Nobody wants to set a precedent that our government can't respond to threats or they can't respond properly to stuff like mad cow disease. That's not the issue here. The issue starts to come in with respect to if you're going to apply an approach, that approach has to be considered and that approach has to apply to all of the varying circumstances. That's the nature of what we call the fettering argument, right? When you take away that discretion and you say, no, it's going to be just this, even though it doesn't fit into this square peg, round hole scenario, we're going to do that. That doesn't make very much sense to kill these birds. And so we really hope that the Court of Appeal agrees with us, but it's a very difficult case.
Now, something that stood out to me when I was watching the hearing was sort of the circular argument that was given about the emergency response plan and whether or not it considered the ostriches or not. I think you'd be best to sort of recap that because the CFIA's counsel said, yes, we did consider. Here's the proof of us considering ostriches. And then you sort of read more to the story there with that. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the emergency response plan is essentially the basis for how this stamping out policy is to be applied in exemptions. That was what their counsel had said. And so when you look at the evidence on how that was developed, well, it was developed based on previous decisions and previous records, right? So it's like a compilation of what's occurred in the past, and now we're going to develop this guide for the future. On cross-examination, their expert who developed it testified that there was no ostrich-related cases in the past or decisions in the past. So this was the first time this was actually being applied to an ostrich situation, which tells you that it's developed for something else with a different context in mind. So the evidence that they presented was that their expert had read an article and had potentially spoken at a conference, which is fine, but any consultations which occurred with the poultry industry. Any consideration of how to develop this plan came from previous decisions and previous history and records, which had nothing to do with ostriches. So ultimately, you can say you considered something, but this admission is significant because you're admitting that this has nothing to do with ostriches, no matter what your contemporaneous considerations were. So it's a difficult one to reconcile. I know that there was a lot. There was also a lot on fettering, right? So fettering occurs, and I'm so sorry, I'm going to turn this off. Fettering occurs when Parliament grants you discretion, and then you make a blanket policy or decision that takes away that discretion, right? Because Parliament knows when to use the word shall, when they use the word must, when they use the word may. This is not a situation where legislation is based on inference. They use words intentionally, and so there's one argument that the inspector had no discretion because he had to issue the notice of disposal. We say that's fettering. And the argument is, well, the minister used his discretion to create the stamping out policy, which is the ERP. And we say, well, that didn't include any ostrich situations or any consideration of ostriches, and therefore that's fettering because you're applying that there. And then there's a situation where you say, well, certain exemption criteria They can be based on analysis and they're not automatic, so they're not fettered. But again, those criteria come from the ERP, which is a product of non-ostrich related work. So, that argument is very difficult when it comes to, well, was the decision fettered or not? You can make a reasonable decision. You can make an analysis. We don't have to agree with your decision. It has to be intelligent, justifiable. It has to be something that can be scrutinized by the courts. But if you put in this kind of blanket thing and you say, well, you can't scrutinize it. There's the administrators exercise discretion. There is no discretion. There's some discretion, but none of this is based on anything to do with ostriches who we're now killing. That's where we say the problems arise.
When I look at the pushback against this cull order, it's reached international levels, it's nonpartisan, it's unlike many of the stories that I've covered of government overreach. Um, how much do you believe, or can you speak to how much do you think the fear of, hey, if we do not cull these animals, that could potentially maybe open up the doors for maybe other farmers to bring on legal action. Do you think that that is one of the main reasons the CFIA is not backing away?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, nobody wants a precedent, and I think and I'm speculating, but I think that this is perhaps their fear, right? Is that you have a precedent that doesn't allow CFIA to deal with emergencies or these situations. That's not what we're saying. The CFIA can do what it needs to do under its mandate under the Health and Animals Act. The issue here is how you do that, right? So if you're going to develop a guide or a response plan, then it needs to have that consideration of, okay, well, this is going to apply to all of these different species and animals, and here's what we did to consider that and incorporate that. We don't have that here, right? So we're not saying you can't have a guide. We're not saying you can't have a stamping out policy. What we're saying is that it has to be reasoned and it has to be reasonable and justified. In this case, it's not. So it's not a question of saying CFIA can't do it or they have to deal with a million challenges. They just have to do their job, which they want to do properly, as we say, in a reviewable manner.
Well, I know you're very busy, so thanks for explaining that to everybody who wasn't able to hear the hearing, and we'll be following the outcome closely.
Thanks, Drea. It's always a pleasure.